After all.
You are listening to Radical Sacred, a podcast centered around spirituality, nature, and connection.
I'm Phil Dickey, pastor, eco-spiritualist, activist, friend of trees, and a small-town Missourian living in the heart of Dallas.
And I'm Jenny Mislin, spiritual director, teacher, seeker, bird watcher, and a homesick Texan living in France.
Join us now as we live the questions, learn from open-hearted conversations, and explore our own deep and sacred roots. A Prayer of Shelter and Shadow by Pádraig Tuama. We know that sometimes we are alone, and sometimes we are in community. Sometimes we are in shadow, and sometimes we are surrounded by shelter. Sometimes we feel like exiles, in our land, in our languages, and in our bodies. And sometimes we feel surrounded by welcome. As we seek to be human together, may we share the things that do not fade: generosity, truth-telling, silence, respect, and love. And may the power we share be for the good of all. We honor God, the source of this rich life, and we honor each other, storyful and lovely. Whether in our shadow or in our shelter, may we live well and fully with each other. Amen.
Phil and Pádraig Tuama.
Yeah, that's from Pádraig's daily prayers for the Corrymeela community. If anybody's wanting to find his prayers, are beautiful.
Yeah. We are super excited today. Mary Fontana is with us. She is the author of Strangers in the Province of Joy, Practicing Radical Hospitality on the US-Mexico Border. We've read a lot of books this year, and all of them have been really good, all of them. But this one is very powerful and very timely and very important, I think, for all of us to remember what's happening on our borders, to be present, to be aware, to be a part of. All right, I'm gonna get off my high horse, but read this book. It's great. This is a narrative history of the migrant house of hospitality, where she has volunteered for the past 2 decades. Her writing has been published in a lot of different places. She was a finalist for the 2025 Richard J. Margolis Award for Social Journalism and has been nominated for Best of the Net, the Chautauqua Janus Prize, and the Forward Prize. She trained as a scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, and did infectious disease research for a decade before turning to writing full-time. She now lives in Seattle with her husband and 2 children. We got to know Mary through our friend Kelly DeChant Hughes, whom we love so much. Welcome, Mary. And is there anything that we missed or that you would just like for us to know about you?
That was a good overview. I guess in case anyone is thinking, how does she have enough hours in the day? I should say that I've been involved with Annunciation House for the last 2 decades, but a lot of the work that I do for them now is remote. So I live in Seattle, but I'm there a few times a year. Actually, I was there this past weekend, and I just do a lot of kind of emailing, computer stuff, things with them. But it's been a really nice way to stay involved with an organization that I really love and admire from afar much of the time.
I just feel like infectious disease, a lot of work around the border. Like, there's a lot of things happening in the world right now that I'm sure are like stirring much in your soul, maybe. So just how are you showing up in this episode today, and like, what are you bringing that's maybe heavy on your heart, but maybe also hopeful? I don't want to put things on you that aren't true for you, but just what are you bringing into the space today?
Yeah, there is a lot that's so heavy in the world right now, but I do have to say that, as you mentioned, I have 2 kids. They're 12 and 9, and I think being the daily work of being a parent keeps me in the present moment and keeps things from being I guess too grave at any one time. There's so many problems in the world, but I still had to get up with my 9-year-old and make oatmeal and then play a game of cards before he went out the door. And I guess maybe the lesson there for me is just that, of course, we need to stay engaged with the problems of the world. I don't want to simply insulate myself within my own home, but I think through connection with other people, including our children, if we have them, that's where like the hope is, and that's where the energy is. And I felt that too this past weekend. I was down, as I mentioned to you before we started, just a moment ago, I was down in El Paso, gathering with other people who work for refugee and immigrant rights, and everyone is struggling right now with all of the difficult policies that have been put in place, but gathering together and reminding each other of the importance of the work and the fact that many people are doing it is really life-giving.
Talk to us about Annunciation House and how you became connected with them, and this is like a three-parter. How you became connected with them and how you decided to write a book about their work.
Well, I really think if Annunciation House had a name that was towards the latter part of the alphabet, I would never have gotten connected with them at all, because in college, I went to a Jesuit college where a lot of people do a year of volunteer work after they graduate. And I thought I might want to do that. And I went to our career center, and they had a big binder. This is like in 2004, everything's on paper still. A big binder of volunteer opportunities arranged alphabetically. And I didn't get very far before I found Annunciation House. And I just thought it sounded really neat without really knowing much about it at all. It's a house of hospitality on the US-Mexico border, located in El Paso, Texas. It's been around since 1978. So by the time I got there, it had been around for about 25 years. And it's a volunteer organization where volunteers live in houses. We call them houses. They're all these kind of various ramshackle old buildings that have been donated at one time or another for use for hospitality. So they provide shelter, food, clothing, just very basic services. And I think one thing to note is when Annunciation House was founded back in the 70s, the people who started it weren't really setting out to do anything specifically for migrants or refugees. First of all, they really wanted to do something for themselves. They had a deep hunger to have more meaning and purpose in their lives, and they thought they could perhaps find that through some kind of service. And then they looked around their community and said, who are the poorest of the poor in our community? Who really is slipping through the cracks? And in El Paso, that was the undocumented refugees, some people who had lived in the area for a long time but didn't have documents and therefore couldn't go to any of the other shelters or food banks in town. And then some were refugees recently arrived from Central and South America. And so the house said, this is who we're going to serve because these are the people who most need our help. And even the word help, I sort of dislike, but the people we can accompany who nobody else is paying attention to. So it started that way. So yeah, I found it in this binder under the A's and applied, and had never been to the border before, and flew down there for a year of service when I was fresh out of college. Ended up staying for more than a year because I just really loved it. I loved living in the houses and meeting people and hearing their stories. And it was very challenging, but it was also very a time of a lot of personal growth. And since then, I've remained involved in various ways. So one of the things I've done is been on the board of directors. It's an official nonprofit, so it has a board. And over the years, I joined that in 2010. And something we have talked about over the years is kind of preserving the history of the organization, especially as its founders got older. They were all young people when they started, and that was almost 50 years ago. So now they're in their 70s. And some of those stories of the founding in the early days, we were just very aware that if they weren't preserved in some way, they would be lost. And so when my younger son started public school, I thought, this is my opportunity, because now I have childcare. I have some time to work on something that's not, not a job with a salary. And so that's about 4 years ago when he started kindergarten. That's when I started in earnest to work on this book. And I sat down with several of the founders for long interviews about those early days. I talked to some guests who were there in the early days, and then also throughout all the decades to the present, talked to different volunteers and guests, and read a lot of old newspaper articles and newsletters, and really immersed myself in the history and sifted through and had to leave out a lot, but condensed it into a story.
You mentioned that you had never been to the border before you had gone down for this. Um, I love that in the beginning of the book you talk about both. There's geographic borders, but that's typically what we think of, right? When we say the border, so often our minds go to the 2,000-mile border between roughly California and Texas and the southern side of our United States. Our mind doesn't initially go to Canada, right? It's just where our mind goes, and there's so many reasons why that is. But you don't stop there. You also talk about like internal borders as well. So whenever you hear border, having never been to the border before you went and served here, like what does border still stir in you now?
Mm. I think now I think of it really as liminal space, as a place where lots of change is always happening, and where change is possible, and therefore it's a very exciting place to be, maybe challenging and also exciting. Um, the US-Mexico border in El Paso is interesting to me because, and I talk about this in the book, the two sides of the border there are very interconnected. They're more like each other than they are, the Mexico at the border is more like the US at the border than it is like the rest of Mexico if you've traveled in the interior. And so I think people from the border think of those two countries as very closely connected. And the further you get away from it, the more it seems like a place of division. But it's also a place of encounter. So I guess there's just like so much to me that's there in the border. And then in terms of thinking about it, not in geographical terms, but other kinds of borders, what comes to mind is just the divisions between us and them, and the many places in which that manifests itself. We all, I think humans, we evolved as a tribal species, and we define ourselves and we define others sort of in opposition to ourselves. But one transformation I really at least began on the border and have tried to continue is to stop looking at it in terms of us and them, and to think, oh, I have something very much in common with these other people that I thought were scary, or that I thought were foreign, or that I thought, who are different from me. Like, we can recognize our differences, but there doesn't have to be a sharp border between us. There can instead, it can be a bridge, not a wall.
That's so lovely. I really love the portion of your book about borders, and I'm a really avid birder, and so my favorite birding organization, the Bird Collective, has some great stuff that they sell that raises funds for birds. And one of the shirts that they have right now says migration is an earth right. How for most of human history, wildlife and people have moved. We've been in motion, and that borders are a man-made construct for sure. Will you talk to us about migration being an earth right, and the borders we find ourselves encountering currently? Yeah.
Yes, I've been reading a lot about this recently, about the teachings of different sort of religious traditions about migration, and many, certainly in Catholicism, in many strains of Christianity, in Judaism, there is this very fundamental tenet that the goods of the earth are for all people. That the bounty of the earth is not meant to be carved up and reserved just for a certain few, with others shut out from it, but that it's for everyone. And certainly there's teaching from several major religions that's very explicit, that if you can, that first of all, that people have a right to remain in their homes. They should be safe where they are. They should be able to feed their families where they are. But if they can't do that, that they absolutely have a right to migrate and cross borders in search of a dignified, sustainable life. One thing I think that it's important to keep in mind in this very modern, globalized age, I understand that we want a rule of law, and we want, I guess, just to say, I'm sympathetic. I understand the appeal of saying, well, there's these different countries and they each, take care of their own. And if you're not from this country, it's not necessarily our job to take care of you. You should go back and work in your own country for whatever system you want. So I guess there is a certain appeal to that because it's kind of clean and tidy. But we live in an age where money crosses borders, where goods cross borders. And I mean, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that was signed in 1994, made official a lot of that interchange, let's just say, between the US and Mexico. Money can flow very freely, goods can flow very freely, but it explicitly blocked people from flowing. And so we now have a system in which money has more rights, more freedom than people. And that's where I think we need to look at that idea of, oh, well, our country should just take care of itself and your country should take care of itself. Well, we're not doing that. We're already exchanging all these other things. We are interconnected. And it's as though we just want to pluck people out of that equation, and we can't do that. Yeah. So, and I also actually, just one more thing, because I was reading some, I'm Catholic. I come out of a Catholic tradition. I have a lot of family members who are Catholic, and I've been talking to them recently about different controversies in immigration. And the Catholic Church very explicitly says nations do not have, it is unethical for nations to, let me say, it does allow, says that nations can control their borders. They can have, reasonable policies to control the flow of people in and out, but they cannot bar people simply because they want to maintain a higher standard of living for their own people while other nations are struggling with basic necessities of life. And I recognize that there's a great fear for many Americans who are struggling, that if we are more permissive in our immigration laws, that they will have even less, and they're already feeling like they're struggling. But I think that the problems there are not strict. They're not because of immigrants. Like here in Seattle, we have a huge housing shortage. It's a big problem. We have a homelessness problem. If new immigrants come to the city, that might make it feel like they're making the housing problem because they also need housing, but they're not the problem. Like we need to solve our housing problem. So that was a lot of thoughts.
No, that's really good. And thinking about this episode, I was like, there's no way to not get extremely political in this conversation. So I'm just going to just dive into it. And I think that one of the things I think is really important for our listeners maybe is to talk about the root causes of migration and why people look to cross borders. And so, well, I'll leave it to you to explore where you are. I have some thoughts that I really want to talk about on the terms of climate change aspect of it, but I want you go first and then we'll circle back.
Great. One thing I really did want to convey in this book for American readers was all of the ways in which U.S. policy, with a very direct line, has contributed to the reasons that people migrate north. And I mean, you can go back to 1954 in Guatemala. I don't know if I went back this far in my book, but the CIA, and nothing I'm saying is controversial. You can look this up in major history texts, but the CIA organized a coup in Guatemala. There was a democratically elected president there who was carrying out land reforms. And the US had a lot of business interests in that country that would have suffered. There's a connection, like the head of the Secretary of State. There were several very highly placed U.S. officials at that time who sat on the board of the United Fruit Company, which had huge land holdings in Guatemala. You can look all this up. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's just fact. And so the CIA deposed the president and put in a kind of a leader that was more sympathetic to the U.S. And what followed were decades of civil war that by the 1980s was really just full-scale genocide against Guatemalan indigenous peoples. And so a lot of people fled north looking for safety in the U.S. Also in El Salvador, where the U.S. was funding an oppressive right-wing military. And this was all in the context of Cold War and fears about communism. But those things led directly to actually about a quarter of El Salvador's population fleeing north to the US, which is a staggering statistic. So we've laid the roots of a lot of this migration. I already mentioned NAFTA. In the years after NAFTA was passed, migration from Mexico rose extremely sharply and kept rising because NAFTA flooded Mexico with a lot of cheap agricultural products, and it put a lot of Mexican farmers out of business. And they just couldn't, they had farms, they had homes, they just couldn't afford to live there anymore. Right. And those are examples from the past, but this kind of thing we could find more recent examples too. So again, we can't say that we have nothing to do with these people who are coming. We have benefited from their land, their resources. I interviewed a woman from my book who worked in an American factory in Honduras making clothes for Americans and couldn't afford to feed her family. And so she came here. And so we're benefit as an American consumer. I also benefit from all the cheap labor in other countries, as well as, I should point out, the cheap labor provided by undocumented immigrants in the US today who pick our fruit and work in construction, who take care of our elderly. Yeah, and we can come to climate change. Do you want to?
Well,
introduce
I'll reiterate
that
too that I took a trip with college students to Guatemala. I don't remember what year it was, but working with Habitat for Humanity International, and on the bus that picked us up, the college intern that picked us up started giving our bus full of college students the whole history of what you just talked about, the CIA and the overthrow. And you should have seen the looks on the faces of all these college students, right? They were we just thought we were coming to build a house, but this whole history lesson and all it. And so again, I love that you just made the connection so blatantly. We have a hand in this, right? We talking about us who are citizens of the United States, our history plays a role in why so many folks are having to flee. We also learned that Guatemala has the highest per capita of helicopters per person because there's still such unrest in this, that people who have wealth won't even drive on the streets throughout because it's so dangerous to drive. Guatemala City is just not, it's a lovely city, but it's just you got to be very careful where you're going at certain times. So I'll just say thank you for that. I think the climate change one, so we think of violence often, right, as a reason that people flee, and a variety of reasons for violence. Climate change has been one that we've really been focusing on. And I say I work with a group called Texas Impact that does a lot of work here in the state of Texas. And what our executive director was pushing John Kerry back whenever he was the representative from the Biden administration at the COP. I forget what year it was COP, but she asked him, what, are we going to be raising our numbers of people we're willing to accept for migration due to the fact that climate change is happening and forcing folks to flee to other spaces? And there were presentations at COP that year from Palau and different Pacific Islands countries where they were literally standing waist deep in water saying we used to be able to stand here and have vegetation or have spaces here. So it's just something, we tend to go to the violent space and then want to put the violence as their own cause and their own problem to figure out when we know that's not always the case. But there's also the climate change thing, which also typically they are not as responsible for as developed nations and industrialized countries such as the United States and various other ones. So didn't know if you wanted to share more on climate change aspect of it, or if I just wanted to get on my own high horse here and share my own frustrations.
No, I think that's hugely important. There have been reports about climate change worsening drought and also major weather events like hurricanes in Central America that have absolutely contributed to people coming northward. Climate change and violence are also interconnected because as there is more scarcity for resources, people are competing over what's left. And
much less when it's hotter, people get more. There's a rise in violence whenever it's hot.
That's also true.
That's also documented fact, right? So sorry, yeah, I can interrupt you.
Mm-hmm. No, all true. And one thing about climate change, I was talking earlier about how with our economies and the flow of goods, we're all interconnected. But climate change, maybe it's an even more obvious setting in which we're all breathing the same air, which is not to say that climate change affects us, as you mentioned, it doesn't affect us all equally or affect countries equally, but it is coming for it is coming for all of us. The US, and you see those disparities within the US too, whereas the US does experience more extreme climate events, forest fires, bad hurricanes. It is the most poor, most vulnerable that suffer the most from those, but it will affect all of us. So just to add, if there are people who want to say, oh, this isn't our problem, it very much is our problem. And for multiple reasons, we caused it. It is causing people to come here, to get away from it. And ultimately the effects of climate change will touch every one of us.
And I think they're even like planning in the United States, right, of all the folks from the South that are going to be migrating north to the northern parts of the country because of the effects of climate change. And those are, again, who are the folks that can afford to uproot themselves and move, right? Are the like financially mobile, you know, like
yes.
Again, I'm gonna get all worked up here. Jenny, I'm keep talking.
Well, just one more thing about it, because I do have a background in infectious disease, and there are tropical diseases that we've never had to worry about in the US, or not for many, many, centuries, that are going to make a resurgence. There's chikungunya in South Texas. There was the whole Zika virus sort of spread from a few years ago. And I think even things like malaria, as the world warms, we're going to have to worry about some of these diseases that we really haven't worried about in centuries.
I grew up in Texas, and I have a lot of love for Texas. I do. It's a vast and beautiful space in some of the spaces, and there are a lot of different kinds of folks there, and there are a lot of beautiful things about Texas. Unfortunately, I'll probably never live in Texas again because of the politics and all sorts of things. But I have a deep love for it. And when I was growing up in small conservative town in Texas, my church helped a family immigrate from El Salvador. Like, we made it our mission one year to do that. We helped them come here because it was during the Civil War. We helped the folks get a lawyer and get a job and do their green cards and all the things. My small town conservative Texas church did that because that was the right thing to do. And they didn't view it as a political sentiment. They viewed it more as, these folks are in trouble, let's help them. That church today, goodness, if you suggested something like that, they would view it as the most radical, ridiculous leftist thing that anyone has ever said. Can you talk to us a little bit about the othering that has clearly always taken place about people who are different than us, but has escalated over the last 30 plus years? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying that I live in Washington and I grew up here, but I was born in South Louisiana. I have a lot of family there still. We have very different views on immigration. They really, I think you can imagine they are generally against immigration, certainly against any kind of easing of things for people who are here and are undocumented. And at the same time, like you were saying, if they were presented with a family in need, I think even today, and you told them this family's undocumented, but it's a mom and some kids, and they're on the street. I think my family I know this because I know many acts of kindness that they've done. I think they wouldn't hesitate to say, here's some people in need and we're going to help you out. And so one thing is, I think that there's so much of our political lives are lived online now, or lived in the news, where we're not confronted with actual people. Even if we see pictures, there's a sort of remove there. And so I think that is part of the othering, is just that so much of our experience of it is filtered through media, and often through very polarized media. Which is not to say, it's also true that, so the town where I did grow up in Washington State has a lot of, it's a big mix of Mexican Americans and sort of European Americans. And that's a community where everyone knows people. You know, if you're a white person, you know lots of people with Mexican American heritage and vice versa. And it's not like that leads to absolutely no tension at all between those communities. And this happens even at the Catholic Church, where there's debates about having the mass in English and having the mass in Spanish. So I'm not trying to say that, like, if you just know someone who's an immigrant, everything will be better. But it is better. It might not be perfect, but I do think that helps when we're talking about real people that you can imagine and feel empathy for, rather than kind of a big storm or surge or caravan of people, as it's often portrayed in the media. Maybe that's the end of my train of thought. You were asking about, just.
Well, I have an example too, right? We had a small town United Methodist Church here in North Texas where same thing. Like the pastor said, I could never even bring up the word immigration, right? But whenever they were busing all the folks a couple years ago, there was a young couple that was pregnant and she went into labor, and they happened to have like a hospital in this, like, near the small town. And so they just basically, the bus just dropped them off and said, well, here's a hospital. Good luck, you know? And so some of the local churches rallied together and took care of this young family who just had a baby, you know, and eventually like helped them and put them on a bus again a couple days later. But like, he was like, had I ever mentioned immigration from the pulpit, they would have like run me out of there with pitchforks, you know? So, but when there's some aspect to the humanization that people are reminded of the humanization, and just like, again, a new mom with a baby, like we want to take care of them, right? So there is something, I guess, beautiful in that, right? Like, it's beautifully frustrating.
Well, and I think maybe a part of what allows us to reach past some of the politics and just help someone in their need is there's a certain way in which, when we sense that there's an emergency, we set aside our normal prejudices or our need to follow a certain rule. And you could imagine in any town, if there's a hurricane or a fire, a store that normally charges for its goods, as it should, is just handing out free water or something, because they say this is an emergency, and I'm just going to set aside the normal rules or whatever. And so when I was working on the border, you know, many of the people that we were receiving were in an emergency situation, and when you're right there present with them, it becomes very easy to set aside what you might think. Like, yes, of course we need to fix our immigration system. Should they have come this way? No, but that's not the point right now. Right now, they just need, they just need a shower. They just need food. They haven't eaten in 3 days. Like, we just need to take care of this. And then we can get back to arguing over how we should fix this. And I think, when we're reading about it on the news or somehow distanced from it in that way, when there's not an immediate need presented to us, we can stay in the realm of thinking about, well, how should this be? What are the rules? What are the norms that would usually govern this interaction? And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, society needs norms to function, but in these instances of need, I do think it's beautiful when we can set some of that aside and say, we're just two people. You need something that I can give, and I need something that you can give, which is that I have this conception of myself as a good person, for example, and I want to help you. Or you remind me of me when my son was born and I needed some help. Or like, there's a kind of reciprocity. I think actually that's really important. I'm just now circling my way to it. But when we're interacting with someone in person, they can also feed us in a way that's very important. And there's a relationship there that doesn't exist when, in any other context. Like, I think we each are nourished by interaction with another human being. And so when you encounter someone like one-on-one or in a small personal way, it's a much different interaction than when you're sort of thinking about it removed.
I love so many things about this book, but one of the things I love the most is just the 5 people who started the Annunciation House. We're so young and also so wise and so hope-filled and so trusting. And in chapter 2, you write, fortunately, they had just enough wisdom to recognize their ignorance. They agreed they would not attempt to define their purpose right away. Instead, they would get to know their neighbors, pray, and reflect, and try to be available for a mission to choose them. So they entered into a posture of waiting, of listening, of being open. That makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. And also, that is not how most of us operate on a day-to-day basis. Will you talk to us about these folks and their open-heartedness and their willingness to just see what bubbles up, and what a good message might be for all of us in that?
Yes. I know two of those founders personally and have known them for many years. And one thing to note is that before they had moved into Annunciation House and started this mission, they had spent over a year meeting, discerning, reading scripture. And there were a lot of people who participated in that process who ultimately decided not to move into to sort of join the project. And so this is not for everyone. It's very difficult to kind of leave things so open for a long period of time. And Delia Gomez, one of the founders who I interviewed, she talked a lot about this, where people ask us when you meet someone new, they say, "Oh, what do you do?" Which is an innocent question. You're trying to learn about them. But if we don't have a ready answer to that, because we don't know what we're doing, we sort of are left. It's almost like we don't have a value in our society, or we don't know where to place ourselves, and so but they were determined. They really felt this was the right thing to do. We're not sure yet what work we should be doing at Annunciation House. We're going to try to let the community tell us what it needs. And so it was many months before they really had a clear sense of their vision. And I think that's hard too, because of our culture's emphasis on like productivity, results. What are you doing? What do you have to show for it? I actually, when I was down at Annunciation House this past weekend, I was talking to a volunteer who had come just for a couple of weeks to help out there. So this was a new experience for him. And actually, when he got there, the house wasn't very busy. There just weren't that many people that week. And so he had come ready to just like jump in, help with everything. Like, I want to do as much as I can while I'm here. And there just wasn't that much actual work to do. And I could tell that was difficult for him, because he wasn't able to help he thought he wasn't able to help as much as he wanted to. And I tried to explain, we just need someone here, whether you're busy or whether you're not busy. It's the gift of your presence. We don't know if tomorrow will be really busy and then you'll be called to do more things, but also just being here is incredibly valuable. You can spend time with people. And so to sort of shift. I think the volunteers, everyone who's there, has to sort of shift from this idea of measuring their worth or their contribution based on how much they accomplished, or like what they did, or sort of things they can point to in the world that they contributed to, and instead just putting the value in presence, like in showing up every day. I'm just going to be here, and it might be uncomfortable sometimes. And part of my gift here, part of what I'm doing, is the work of just living in that discomfort. That's my job. It's maybe not building anything. It's not building a house. A lot of volunteer efforts, and there's nothing wrong with this, are like, we're going to build a house and you could see what you did at the end of the day. But sometimes the work that you need to do is just sit with the discomfort of not being that useful, and see what you have to learn from that.
Will you talk a bit about how like spirituality and maybe even contemplative work sustains the work that you do and keeps you in this work, but also those of Annunciation House as well?
Yeah, I think that's an evolving story. When I was at Annunciation House, the volunteers there participate in a regular practice that we call reflection, and it's just a daily time for reflection that the different volunteers take turns leading, and it can take very different forms, from like guided meditation or journaling or talking about current events or just talking about your experiences in the houses. And one thing I know from experience is that when things are really busy at Annunciation House, sometimes volunteers want to skip reflection because they have so much to do in a day, and they're going to take 1 hour where they just sit down and it feels like do nothing. Just sort of be with each other. And it feels like, maybe it feels like a luxury that they can't afford, or it feels like it doesn't really have a purpose. But the house and people who have been there longer and sort of like the leadership really, really try to emphasize that, no, this is essential for everything else, because otherwise what you're doing there could just be housework. It could just be, it could just be sort of transactional. Like, oh yeah, today I need to mop a bunch of floors and make some beds and cook a bunch of beans. And like, what am I doing with my life? And I have a PhD, I should be doing something more important than this. But if you can sit and, or if you could take time to reflect on what you're doing and cast it in a different light, it becomes so valuable. Like, I'm preparing this home to receive people who have been on a long journey. They have been in detention where they were dirty and they couldn't get clean. And I'm going to make sure this floor is clean so that they walk in here and they think, oh, I can relax. And it just feels very welcoming. And I think, yeah, the contemplation or the reflection is so important to like imbue everything else you do that day with meaning that then sustains it, because it's so much more. Otherwise, I think the tedium of the daily tasks is just, you think, why am I here? What am I doing? I mean, honestly, now I find a lot of my contemplation relates to parenting, which in some ways is not so different than like running a migrant house of hospitality. Like, oh, I have to cook dinner again. Oh my gosh, the books from our bookshelf are scattered all across the floor again. Like, every day I just do the same things. But of course, it's my love for my children, my desire to to take care of them and to teach them and this and that makes me say, okay, I'm gonna cook dinner again. I'm going to help my child pick up all these books that he scattered. We're going to do that together. Yeah, I just think it's so important. I think it also helps me live out of gratitude rather than anything else. If I can take some time, sometimes I think we can get caught up in what we don't have or what we haven't done. And so I think contemplation, just taking some time to reflect on what I do have, the fact that I'm actually okay, can help me live out of a sense of gratitude rather than gratitude and abundance that lets me be generous in my time and in my all those things are what I feel contemplation sort of brings to the surface in me.
I really love that. And that's the contemplation aspect of this. The ability of these folks to be present, to set aside expectation, and not to say that they never had expectations and it wasn't hard and that they were always present. No. But to do this kind of work, or to do the work that really is yours, I think you have to be present and you have to set aside expectation, or else you just are stuck in a tidal wave of to-dos. Like, you're just stuck in a tidal wave of to-dos and you don't know when to just be present. Will you talk to us about the folks who started Annunciation House and their work of truly being present to people that they serve, and what that looks like on the day-to-day, being someone who's been involved for the last 2 decades in different forms? What does it look like to really be present to the needs of folks who are sometimes in really desperate situations?
Yeah, I think there's multiple ways to answer this question, and maybe first I'll say I think there's always in the work of the house a tension between, I'll call it like Mary and Martha from the biblical story of Mary sitting down with Jesus and Martha going and like cooking him a meal, right? I think I'm more of a Martha, but but I want to be more of Mary. And I think the founders in those early days, they had to just sort of figure out how they were going to survive. They had to fix up the house. They had to, figure out how they were going to eat and all of this. And there was a lot of busy work, but then they also knew, because they had this, because they had spent a lot of time meeting with each other and trying to form community with each other, that they needed that community, and that as guests started to come and stay at the house, that those guests were part of the community, and that it was important to just spend time with them, listening to their stories, to really bring them into that community. There's a quote from the liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez that says something like, I'm paraphrasing, if you're not truly sharing in the life of the poor, then there can be no love between you, because love only exists between equals. So I think if you're just serving meals to someone and you're not sitting down with them and sharing who you are and hearing who they are, then you're keeping that relationship as sort of unequal. I'm helping you, I'm handing something down to you. And that's not really what they wanted to do. I think that's patronizing, and you run the risk of really doing more harm than good. Whereas if you sit down with someone first and you say, this is me, here's why I'm here, what's your name, why are you here, what do we have in common, what can I do for you, what can you do for me? Now once that relationship exists, things can go back and forth between you in a way that's much more equitable and like empowering, and I think enriching for both of you. And I think the founders of Annunciation House recognized that. And they really got to know people. And I mean, there are several of the people, the former guests that I interviewed for this book, were people who stayed at Annunciation House in the 1980s, and they are still dear, dear friends of Ruben Garcia, who's the founder, because they really forged a friendship, and they've kept in touch, and they've had very different lives, but they had that experience in common. Another thing to say, though, is that as the organization has grown, and so Ruben Garcia, he was one of the founders, and he is the director, and he's now the executive director for he's been in that role for the organization's entire existence. And as the work has grown, and there have been more than one house, and there's been more sort of administration needed, he actually now spends very little time, well, not very little, but much less time in our houses of hospitality talking with the guests that stay there. And I know that that's been very difficult for him, because that's what he loves. But he also recognizes that he can do more by taking on some of these leadership roles. You know, he flies around the country and speaks and tries to raise consciousness about migration justice. But that's a constant tension for him. And I think this, I think you can find discussions in old Catholic worker kind of writings about this. Like, how do we balance between connecting with individual people and sort of doing the most good for the most people? Those things can be sort of pulling you in different directions. And so I think Ruben still struggles with that, and that he now has a lot less direct presence with the people that he really got in this to serve. And that's a lot. He feels that as a loss, even as he wants to sort of expand the reach of the organization.
I'm glad you started to go that direction, because that's really my mind was going, was when you think of just, again, a house that's providing shelter, and more than just shelter, right? But like really caring for, like you said, emergency, right? When there's an emergency that we can directly address, I think theologically we would kind of say that's like a mercy ministry, right? Like it's a ministry that's providing mercy to to work with those who are suffering and need emergency being affected immediately. When you move to kind of the justice side of things, like what you're saying, right? That's a much broader picture, and like it makes me think of that old quote of like, when I fed them, they called me a saint, but whenever I asked why they're hungry, they called me a communist, right? Like, my question was going to be, right? Like, has Annunciation House really been able to stick to a specific goal of like, no, this is what we do, like we focus on the mercy side, or is there this aspect of we have to start addressing the broader issues, right? Like we have to recognize that it's that old tale of like, do we just keep pulling babies out of the river, or do we go up the river and recognize who's putting the babies in the river in the first place, And right. So if there is the justice component to it, which I hear you saying, just by him going around and sharing some, like, is it education? Is it policy reform, right? Like, why has nobody been able to reform immigration policy for so long? Whenever we all can, both sides of the aisle recognize it needs broken, needs to be fixed. But like, anyway, so like, is education, is it policy? Like, what are the pieces that really move to this sense of justice for this specific, I don't even want to say issue. It's more than just an issue, right? Like, it's people.
Yes. Yeah. Annunciation House absolutely considers justice to be part of its mission. And I would say that the main thing it focuses on that is kind of education. I do think one big piece of how it then might, how it sees itself perhaps affecting the larger world of policy and public thought is through the volunteers that go there for a year, learn a lot about it, and then go out into careers in immigration law and human rights. And we had a former volunteer. We've had former volunteers go on and do a lot of things that are immigration related that I think are really powerful. Another important thing that Annunciation House tries to do is we call them border immersion groups. So a lot of times it's college students or parish groups, but we bring people down to the border and just try to show them the realities of migration. And a lot of people just have no idea how difficult it is to emigrate legally to the United States. So I think there's this impression that you just have to fill out a certain amount of paperwork and you can come, and that's not true. Most people who come illegally could not have come any other way. So I think like educating people and then sending them back to their communities and saying, tell your neighbors, work in your own communities. So I think that part is it's very important to the mission of Annunciation House. It tends to get less focus from the organization, especially just because anytime there is a huge number of people needing hospitality, that takes precedence. But that's been Annunciation House has been running those immersion groups, I think, since the early 1990s, and it is a really important part of the mission, just like consciousness raising, or there's a word in Spanish, concientización, that's we consider very important.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's beautiful.
Mary, what are your hopes for this book about spreading the word for Annunciation House?
When I was writing it, I was thinking of really two different groups of readers. And one was all the people who have been at Annunciation House, who have worked there as a volunteer or who have stayed there as guests. And in particular, the guests that I interviewed were really glad to share their stories. Most of them have lived pretty quiet lives. Some of them are still undocumented, and they appear under pseudonyms in the book, but they really can't be public about what they've gone to, but they loved talking about their lives. And I hope that they feel sort of honored and seen by appearing in this way and kind of having their stories very lovingly told. The other population that I really am thinking of is I really hope that people like my relatives in Louisiana, who are good people with very different views than me on immigration, will read this and think a little more about why people migrate to the US, realize that the things that they want are not different than the things that the readers want for themselves and their families, and just extend a little more empathy, maybe be a little more curious about how we got to this place and understand the US role in it. So yeah, I'm really hoping to reach kind of readers who might be persuaded to think a little more expansively about immigration and how we might respond to people arriving here.
Okay, so the title of the book, Strangers in the Province of Joy, Practicing Radical Hospitality on the US-Mexico Border. So you put radical in front of hospitality. We put radical in front of sacred as our title for our podcast. Will you share a bit about why radical hospitality?
Yes. When I first started writing this book, the way that I was thinking about why it's radical was the fact that the founders of Annunciation House were inviting strangers into their home. And that is kind of whoa, we've all given hospitality to our friends and our family members, but if you're just going to take someone you really have never met before and say, come into my home, sit at my table, we're good. I see you as my neighbor, as my brother. And I think of that as a very radical thing to do. As I was writing it, and especially because I started this in 2022, and since then it's been such a tightening of the screws on immigrants and on organizations working with immigrants. It's become, it's become even more politicized than it was before. And so I thought, I then began to think about sort of a slightly different understanding of radical, which is that all Annunciation House is doing is basic hospitality. We have a priest on the Annunciation House board who calls it sort of like Matthew 25, the Matthew 25 mission, which is, when I was hungry, you gave me food, and when I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. It's very basic. And those things in themselves, they don't seem like they should be controversial. But when the people that you're extending hospitality to are demonized and rounded up and deported and treated very terribly and scapegoated, then simply extending hospitality to those people does become a radical act, because you're crossing a line that's been drawn around that group. You're putting yourself, sort of like the politics came to Annunciation House because this group of people that it served with very basic things have been so vilified. And so in that way, that's now, when I got to the end of writing the book and looking at the way that our country was going, I thought, oh, this is radical in a political way as well.
Can I just say too, because we haven't talked about it, but there was a lawsuit that Attorney General Ken Paxton brought against Annunciation House just last year, right? I think was it just last year?
It started in 2024,
okay.
But it's still ongoing.
And so it's still ongoing. So you probably can't talk a lot about it. But I will say this, as somebody, again, who's on a board of a nonprofit that does work mostly in the state of Texas, predominantly in the state of Texas, but obviously immigration is a part of that, even though it's a federal aspect. There's still implications for the state of Texas. Annunciation House became like the flag to all of other nonprofits in the state of like, hey, you got to get all your ducks in a row, because otherwise the AG might come after you for simply serving and doing what we feel called to as people of faith. And so beyond politics, right? Like, it really felt like the AG was trying to make an example out of y'all. And so just as somebody else who's in a similar space on the board, like, thank you for the work that you are doing. And that I'm so sorry that it was y'all that had to take the brunt of it, or continue to have to take the brunt of it. But like, it's been a warning sign to the rest of us to say, we've got to get our ducks in a row because we could be next.
Yes, it absolutely was. And I will say, of course, Annunciation House does not want to deal with this lawsuit, but there were ways in which the organization was glad that it was them targeted and not some other organizations, because it is one of the oldest, it's been around for a long time, and because it has a ton of community support, I think that it felt it could weather this storm, where some other organizations might. I think this is part of the strategy, is a lot of places don't have the resources to fight something like this, even if they're completely in the right. And so I've been very grateful for how the local bishop of El Paso, who's a very staunch advocate for migrants, our congressional representative, the county judge, just like the whole community was very much supportive when this whole thing happened. And so if this can be something that gives a little bit of a shield to other organizations doing this good work, then we didn't want this test, but we'll go, since it's here, what else is there to do but weather it? Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and say it, since I'm the one that doesn't live in Texas or volunteer in Texas currently, but I want this to be a reminder of the kind of man that Ken Paxton is as he ran for John Cornyn's seat. I want this to be a reminder of the kind of man that Ken Paxton is, someone that goes after an organization that cares for people who are desperate. who have really
It's so interesting because we're recording this on the day that the election's happening between Cornyn and Paxton, so it's not going to come out for a couple weeks probably. But so who knows whether he's the actual up for the Senate or not. But yes, thank you, Jenny. And sorry, I interrupted you, but thank you for saying that.
I don't know who goes after an organization that cares for the most desperate people. Well, I do. It's Kim Paxton. But it should tell us a lot about whether we want them as an elected official. And we'll switch topics now. But Mary, this book is so valuable and so important and so tender. Where can folks find it? And what do you have coming up that you would like for people to know about?
You can order it directly from the publisher, orbisbooks.com, I think it is. You can also get it anywhere you buy books, Amazon, your local independent bookstore, bookshop.org. You can also, and I fully support this, ask your local library to get a copy. I am a huge fan of libraries, and I would love it if it's in your local library so that everyone can check it out. Lately, I've been just writing a number of articles kind of related to immigration in the book. So if people just want to check out something I've written, I had a recent opinion piece in the National Catholic Reporter, and I have something coming out in Sojourners soon. And you can go to my website, maryfontana.com, if you want to just see everything that I've been working on.
Mary, thank you for this book and for the work that you've done over the last 20 years with Annunciation House, and just for who you are in the world and for what you are continuing to stand for. We're grateful for your radical hospitality.
And thanks so much for having me. This was a delightful conversation.
Thank you for being a part of the Radical Sacred community.
In these uncertain times, may you cling to hope and deep connection, and may you work towards living in a spirit of reciprocity with all beings.
Our lovely intro and outro music is Beach Song by the band Saren.
And it's just the two of us here at Radical Sacred, so please help us out by sharing with your friends, rating and reviewing us. Find more of our work on Substack and Instagram.
Remember, you are on sacred ground. Stay rooted.
Here we go.